Hi, I'm Donald Davidson. I'm the historian for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and this is part of the series called Stories with Donald. Then the next year, there were some new rear-engine cars, and there were new Lotuses for Jim Clark and Dan Gurney again. And then the 1963 cars, a couple of them were sold off. And Bobby Marshman, a very, very promising young American driver who I think that, I tell people Bobby Marshman was Rick Mears before you had Rick Mears, and that if Roger Penske had a team at the time, Bobby Marshman was Roger Penske material. Well, anyway, Clark won the pole with one of the new Lotuses, and Bobby Marshman with one of the previous year's cars qualified second. I think there was 12 rear-engine cars of the 33 that year, and Chapman had decided to make a deal with the British Dunlop company, and that was that's what they ran on in Grand Prix. And so Dunlop developed a tire for Indianapolis. Well, unfortunately, there were troubles, and very early on in the race, the tires began to chunk. And Bobby Marshman had led with the 63 Lotus and then dropped out. He bottomed out trying to lap a car and went down into the infield, and it ripped the oil plug out, and so he was out of the race. And that put Clark then into the lead by a pretty good margin on the 39th lap, I think, and on the 47th, there was like 7 or 8 laps. There was a huge roar from the crowd, and down the straightaway, here comes Clark, and the tread had broken away from the carcass on the left rear and had beaten away at the suspension, and then led to it breaking, and then the left rear wheel folded over, and Clark was able to very skillfully steer it down into turn 1 and down into the infield grass, and was out. And then an hour or so later, the word came through from London. They called, and Dunlop thought that out for safety reasons that let's withdraw the Dan Gurney car. So it was right sad, because Dan could have probably finished, 3rd or 4th, and they actually pulled the entry in concern that there might be a replication of Clark's tire problem. So in '65, Lotus came back again, and this time Jim Clark won by a very comfortable margin, and he led 190 of the 200 laps. A.J. Foyt in a 64 Lotus won the pole, but in Sheraton Thompson colors, and Clark started second. And then Dan Gurney was on the outside of the front row with the brand new All-American Racing team that was going to build Eagles, but they hadn't yet. And so the Yamaha special on the outside of the front row was also a Lotus. So there were 3 Lotuses on the front row, but all in completely different paint jobs and so on and so forth. Clark led the first lap, I think, and then Foyt passed him to lead lap 2, and then lap 3 it was Clark. And so it looked like there was this great wing-ding, battle going to take place. And Clark later said, "I let him go because I wanted to see what he had." So I don't know that the Foyt people like that very much, but that was just Clark being very, very honest. Well, anyway, Clark made his first stop, and then Foyt led for 9 laps, came in to make his stop, and then Clark led the rest of the way. So he led 190 of the 200 laps, and so a rear-engine car won the Indianapolis 500 for the first time. And then second place was Parnelli Jones in one of the previous year's Lotuses. So in very short order, in '65, they'd gone from 1 rear-engine car in '61 and '62 to 4 in '63 to 12 in '64 to 27 in 65, and in 66 there was only one front engine car in the race. So Lotus continued on for a short time. After that, after winning the race in 64, Ford withdrew either all or most of its support. They'd won, that's what they wanted. Ford won the Indianapolis 500, why keep doing it? And so then Chapman needed financial help, and a very, very unlikely combination of Jim Clark, Colin Chapman, and Andy Granatelli. And I remember some of us thinking, well, I wonder how that's going to work out. But anyway, long story short on that one, Jim Clark finished second in a Lotus that was horror of horrors, wasn't painted green, but Granatelli STP fluorescent red-orange. And Al, a very young Al Unser, was his teammate. And he was running third at about three-quarter mark when he had an accident. I'm not sure if there was a mechanical failure, but he did hit the wall and was out of the race. And then Jim Clark went on to finish second. In 67, they had a very disappointing year. They had built a slightly longer chassis to house the H16 BRM engine, and H16. That didn't materialize, and so they had to go back to the Ford, and the specially designed chassis and the old Ford, or the Ford that was pretty much the 64, 65 engine. I didn't say, by the way, after the 63 race where they ran the stock block, in 64, the Ford was a purpose-built double overhead camshaft racing engine that had nothing stock block about it. And so that's what they ran in 64, 65, 66, and then they had to fall back in 67. Jim Clark was now joined by Graham Hill, and so on paper it looked like a really strong entry, but it was very much of a disappointment. In fact, Hill had difficulty in qualifying, did qualify, but he was the second one out, and Clark was the third one out. So the Lotuses were 31st and 32nd. And then in 1968, there were 4 new Lotuses at the track. They were rear-engined, wedge-shaped, and powered by Pratt & Whitney gas turbine engines. And originally Jim Clark was to be the lead driver on the team with Graham Hill, and then Clark actually was at the track and tested one just a week or two before he left to go to Hockenheim, Germany for a Formula 2 race, and he was fatally injured. So that was a huge, huge blow, not only to the fans, because Clark had a huge following, even to this day, massive following. And so there was a lot of trial and tribulations with drivers. Jackie Stewart was going to be his replacement, but he had a cracked wrist from an accident in Spain, and so he couldn't pass the physical. And it ended up that, it's a very long story, but the short version is that, in fact, Mike Spence, a British driver who then came in as yet another replacement, was fatally injured in practice. It was really a tough few weeks there. And, but it ended up that Joe Leonard, American motorcycle champion turned 500 driver, won the pole, and Graham Hill qualified second, and then Art Pollard qualified the third car with the turbines. None of them finished. Hill had a suspension failure at around the halfway mark and was out, hit the wall. And Joe Leonard from the pole was expected to dominate the race, and he didn't. He only led a handful of laps, but in the late stages, he was leading. And there was an accident. Carl Williams, driving one of the AJ48 cars, had an accident. And so when they were poised for the restart with 10 laps to go, Joe Leonard was leading, with the Lotus turbine, and Bobby Unser with a turbocharged Offie Eagle was running second. And when the green flag came out, Leonard had they called it a flame out, and I think it was a broken fuel pump, I think. Well, anyway, he pulled off into the first turn, and then Bobby Unser soloed the last 9 laps to win the race. That was fairly close to it for Lotus. For 1969, they came back with a team which on paper looked more than formidable. Now that I think this was the Lotus 64, I think was the number, and the drivers were Mario Andretti, Graham Hill, and Jochen Rindt. 4-wheel drive, wedge-shaped, turbocharged Fords. And, you know, so that looks, well, that's the front row. Well, they had difficulties in practice. Hill and Rindt never could get really going, but Mario did. And Mario was running above the track record unofficially, and he got up to 172. And so he looked like a shoe-in for the pole. Well, the entire first weekend was washed out. There was just one qualifying attempt on Saturday, and won't go into that, but it ended up that the first weekend of qualifying was over and there were no qualifiers. So Mario and Clint Brawner and Jim McGee, the mechanics, thought, well, we've got another week to tweak this thing further. And on the Wednesday, in practice, I think a hub broke, and Mario had a major, major accident. And that Lotus was completely destroyed. The other two, with Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt, they continued practicing, but they were running at around 162, which was like 10 miles an hour slower than Mario had been going. And on the night before the final qualifying day, Colin Chapman decided to just withdraw the team. And so they were done. And I think there was one Lotus in the field. I think Carl Williams, it was either Carl Williams or Art Pollard drove a Grant King prepared car that actually was one of the wedge-shaped Lotuses to be powered by a turbine, which they had now modified. And I think that was the last Lotus in the race, because in 1970, I don't think there were any. And there was a rumor in 1984 that Lotus might come back with a chassis to Indianapolis, and Al Unser Jr. was going to be the driver, and that never happened. And so that was basically it. The tenure was, as far as the Lotus team was concerned, was 63 through 69, and then you know, other than the private entries, pretty soon the Lotus was a thing of the past. But they definitely, you know, Jack Brabham with the Cooper in 61 had turned a lot of heads, but it was Lotus in 63 and then winning the race in 65 that just completely revolutionized racing, and the glorious front engine days were over.